For most of human history, the Aral Sea in Central Asia was the fourth largest lake in the world at about the same size as the US state of West Virginia. The only three that were larger than it were Lake Victoria in Africa, Lake Superior in North America, and of course, the Caspian Sea directly next door to it in Eurasia. But then, in the 1960s, a series of decisions taken by the Soviet Union began to destroy the Aral Sea, and over the decades ever since, it has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. At the current time, now in the 2020s, what little remains of the Aral Sea is less than 10% of its original size back before the 1960s, while more than 95% of its original water volume has simply disappeared. For all intents and purposes, the Aral Sea has died, and the relatively sudden disappearance of a lake this large here has carried with it profound and unforeseen consequences that are pushing the entire region of Central Asia towards calamity and war. It is, without exaggeration, the greatest way the map of the Earth has changed in recent history, and the worst environmental catastrophe of the past 100 years. And it was entirely 100% engineered to happen by mankind's own arrogance. You see, before the 1960s, the Aral Sea had existed here within the dry steppes of Central Asia for thousands of years. Its location in nearly the center of the Eurasian continent meant that it was located in an area with very little rainfall and surrounded by deserts. With nearly 1,500 kilometers between the lake and the nearest body of oceanic water in the Black Sea. As a result, only about a fifth of the Aral Sea's water supply ever actually came from rainfall. And that meant that the remaining 4/5 of its water supply came entirely just from the two mighty rivers of Central Asia that fed it. The Amu Darya that begins in the Pamir Mountains of modern-day Tajikistan, and the Sir Darya beginning in the Tian Shan Mountains of modern-day Kyrgyzstan. Naturally being located in the middle of a desert, the Aral Sea suffered from a high rate of evaporation, but for most of its history, the sea's evaporation rate was roughly equal to the same amount of water that flowed into it from the rivers and the limited rainfall. A delicate balance of equilibrium between evaporation and water inflow existed here for centuries, and thus the sea's existence was present across most of human history and almost always defined local geopolitics. It formed the westernmost frontier of the advancing Chinese Tang dynasty in the 8th century, and became the frontier of the advancing Russian Empire 1,000 years later. By the 20th century, the entirety of Central Asia, including the Aral Sea, was dominated by the Soviet Union. In the 1930s, Joseph Stalin introduced a new program in the country called the Great Transformation of Nature, involving the Soviets reworking and reshaping their nature and their geography to better suit their agriculture and industry. By the early 1960s, under the Khrushchev administration, the Great Transformation of Nature had turned its eye towards reshaping the geography of Soviet Central Asia. The plan was to build out a vast system of canals that would divert water from the Amu Darya and Sir Darya rivers and irrigate large stretches of new farmland across the desert steppes of Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. New farms that would primarily be growing what the Soviets were calling white gold, cotton. And by the 1970s, their Central Asian cotton project had gotten even more dire. In 1973, on the other side of Eurasia, Egypt went to war with Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Egypt lost the war and they agreed to a peace treaty with Israel, exchanging their own diplomatic recognition of the Israeli state for the territorial return of their Sinai Peninsula. And in doing so, firmly switched sides in the Cold War from the Soviet camp over to the Western camp. By 1977, the Soviets had quit selling their weapons to Egypt, and the Egyptians retaliated by suspending all of their massive cotton exports to the Soviets. And in response to that, the Soviets chose to double down on their transformation of nature in Central Asia, to more favor their own domestic cotton production. And for a time, it actually worked really well. By 1988, the Uzbek SSR all on its own was the largest exporter of cotton in the world, helped tremendously by the Soviet-made irrigation canals diverting water from the Amu and Sir Darya rivers. But the high price for this abundance of cotton production in the middle of the desert was already beginning to become apparent, because the Aral Sea was already shrinking. Remember that 4/5 of the Aral's water supply came from the Amu Darya and Sir Darya rivers. By diverting water from both of them to feed new cotton plantations across Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, the Soviets were depriving that water from reaching the Aral, and the Aral's delicate balance of water inflow matching evaporation rate that had lasted for centuries was severely disrupted. With the evaporation rate remaining the same, but with the rate of water inflow severely reduced, the Aral Sea began to quickly die. And this wasn't helped by the fact that the Soviet irrigation canals were very shoddily constructed and abhorrently inefficient. The Karakum Canal that was finished in 1988, for example, was carrying up to 3 cubic miles of water a year from the Amu Darya across 850 miles of the hot and dry Karakum Desert in Turkmenistan. But anywhere between 30 and 75% of that water the canal carries is simply wasted to omnipresent leaks and simple evaporation. As recently as 2012, it was estimated that only 12% of the canal length in Uzbekistan was actually even waterproofed. And so, in order to make up for all these inefficiencies, the Uzbeks and Turkmen have simply withdrawn ever more water from the river to force more water through the canals and through the leaks. You see, under normal circumstances, the Amu and Sur Darya rivers would collectively discharge close to 14 cubic miles of water a year into the Aral Sea, from snowmelt and glaciers high up in the Tian Shan and Pamir Mountains to the southeast. But because of the Soviet transformation of nature and all the irrigation canals, the water flowing through these rivers reaching the Aral Sea quickly dropped by more than 50% to just 7 cubic miles, and then because of Egypt's decision to quit exporting cotton to the Soviets back in the 70s, and the subsequent Soviet expansion of all the irrigation canals in Central Asia, the water volume reaching the Aral Sea through these rivers eventually plummeted to less than 1 cubic mile by the end of the 1980s. Less than 7% of the water that had been naturally reaching it before the transformation of nature. The Soviets were effectively sucking these rivers dry to irrigate their massive cotton project, and in less than 40 years from beginning, by 1998, the Aral Sea had already lost 80% of its water volume, while its surface area had shrunk by around 60%. And by that point, the death of what little remained of the sea was almost certain. You see, as the sea continued to lose more and more water, it continued to get shallower. Thus, the incoming sunlight heated up smaller volumes of water, and thus the water's surface temperature continued to increase faster and faster, which increased the rate of evaporation ever further. As the Aral Sea continued to lose water, it created this vicious positive feedback loop where the more water it lost, the more rapidly it would continue to lose even more. By 2014, 95% of the water volume in the Aral Sea prior to 1960 had simply evaporated away to nothing, and today, little trace of the former sea remains at all, as you can see in satellite photos like this one that was just taken in 2021. But what does continue to remain to the south is all of the irrigated land still growing cotton in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. Uzbekistan continues to remain one of the top 10 largest producers and exporters of cotton in the world, and controls a significant amount of the worldwide cotton market, representing around 5% of global cotton production and around 10% of worldwide cotton exports. Cotton is therefore Uzbekistan's most significant business, accounting for nearly a fifth of Uzbekistan's exports. The industry is state-owned and dominated by the Uzbek government, while the cotton industry in Turkmenistan is smaller but still significant as the world's 11th largest cotton exporter and producer. But the price that Central Asia has paid to enable this large cotton industry to exist, namely the destruction of the Aral Sea, is truly unbelievable in scale and destruction, and unprecedented in human history. Back in its heyday, the Aral Sea was one of the primary fishing centers of the Soviet economy. 40,000 people were employed in the area's fishing industry, and the Aral produced about a sixth of all the fish caught across the entire Soviet Union. But by the 1980s, as the sea shrank and what remained of the water rapidly became saltier, the fish all began to die and disappear. Already by 1987, commercial fish harvesting on the Aral Sea had become impossible. By the 1990s, the salinity levels in what little remained of the sea had made it impossible for any fish to survive at all. And that wasn't even the fishermen's only problem. As the sea continued to shrink, fishing towns, villages, and ports that used to be directly on the coastline for centuries suddenly found themselves dozens to hundreds of kilometers away from the actual water. The town of Aral was once home to more than 50,000 people and was the primary center of the region's fishing industry, but by 2005, it found itself more than 100 kilometers away from what little remained of the sea. And even after the construction of a dam that brought some of the water back, it still, to this day, finds itself about 15 kilometers away from the water. Consequently, the town has withered away over the decades as tens of thousands of former residents have been forced to move on to opportunities elsewhere. Across the former lake bed, you will find countless fishing boats scattered across the wasteland, most of which have been rotting away in the sun now for decades after having been left abandoned by their crew. The entire fishing industry and economy around the Aral Sea crashed and died in exchange for the cotton industry in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan to thrive. But that was far from the only severe consequence. While it still existed, the Aral Sea served to greatly moderate the climate around it in Central Asia. Cold and fast winds blowing down from Siberia in the winter would hit the sea and soften, leading to warmer than usual temperatures during the winter, while during the summer, the sea would soak up radiation and heat and cool the temperatures down more than usual. Thus, the area around the Aral Sea was a lot more climatically tolerable than elsewhere across the Central Asian deserts, that would be freezing during the winter and scorching during the summer. But obviously, the Aral Sea's destruction also removed these moderating climate effects, and as a result, winds now blow in from Siberia uninterrupted during the winter, and there is nothing to soak up any of the heat during the summer. Consequently, the removal of the Aral Sea has resulted all on its own in an average temperature increase of between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius during the summer months around the area where it once existed. And that's not even factoring in any additional warming coming from global climate change. Further, as the lake dried, it left behind a brand new desert in its place, the so-called Aralkum Desert. And it's basically just a complete post-apocalyptic wasteland. You see, as the lake dried up and evaporated away, the water remaining continued getting saltier and saltier to the point where, by 1998, its salt concentration was 376 grams per liter, which is more than 10 times saltier than ocean water is, and more comparable to levels seen in the infamously salty Dead Sea between Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. Then, as the lake dried up further, more and more of this salt was left behind on the floor of the growing Aralkum Desert that was replacing it. And without the sea to moderate the strong winds blowing in from Siberia to the northeast, the winds began kicking up the dust and the salt to generate large-scale salty dust storms throughout the year. And these dust storms can get huge. They're frequently able to be viewed by satellites from space, and they often reach widths of 150 to 300 kilometers across, or about the size of New Jersey. And everywhere they go, they carry a lot of salt. During the summer months, as much as 30 to 40% of these dust storms' volume is just straight up pure salt. And a lot of those northern and northeasterly winds blowing down from Siberia blow all of that salt and dust across the irrigated cotton fields of Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, which, as you can imagine, is not very good for growing crops. Now, to compensate for this, the Uzbeks and Turkmen have simply withdrawn ever more water from the Amu Darya to flush their fields repeatedly and remove the salt, which ultimately means that crops growing on their farms and plantations require about 4 times as much fresh water to sustain reasonable growth levels as they need under normal growing conditions. But of course, the problem with constantly having to flush the soil with water in order to remove all that salt is not only that it withdraws ever more water from the rivers that feed the Aral Sea, but that it also washes away the minerals and the nutrients in the soil that the crops actually need to grow. And so then, to compensate for that, the Uzbeks and Turkmen have been using an absolutely insane amount of pesticides and fertilizer on their desert cotton fields, as much as 4 times the amount that international health standards believe are acceptable and healthy. So over the decades, a lot of these overused pesticides and fertilizers were simply dumped back into the rivers as runoff and sent into the Aral Sea. And so as the sea shrank, these toxins were left behind on the surface of the new and growing Aralkum Desert as well. So now, not only are the dust storms blowing around a lot of salt, but they're also blowing around a lot of toxins to boot. It probably doesn't also help that back during the Soviet era, there used to be an island within the Aral Sea known as Vozrojdeniya. Its location in the middle of the Aral Sea, surrounded by water in the middle of Central Asia, meant that it was very remote. And so the Soviets constructed a top-secret biological weapons research lab there. That lab is known to have tested numerous biological agents like anthrax, bubonic plague, and smallpox, among many others. And their safety standards left a lot to be desired. In 1971, an amount of weaponized smallpox was somehow released from the lab and infected and killed a few of the residents in the lakeside town of Aral. Hundreds of people were forcefully quarantined, while tens of thousands more were vaccinated. After the Soviet Union collapsed, the lab was hastily abandoned by the largely Russian scientists who worked there in 1992, and then by 2001, as the Aral Sea levels continued to shrink, the island of Vozrojdeniya became a peninsula connected to the mainland. Several of the containers within the lab storing weaponized biological agents were never properly stored or destroyed in the hasty evacuation following the Soviet Union's collapse, and many of them are known to have developed leaks. Most famously, in 2002, the United States intervened to help Uzbekistan with decontaminating 10 burial sites of anthrax on the former island. Today, the former island is completely connected to the rest of the new Aral Sea desert. And it's unclear exactly how much of the biological agents there have gotten into the region's already toxic and salty dust storms. Regardless, the new dust storms blowing up from the new desert are known to have caused numerous negative health effects across the Aral Sea region. Toxic chemicals associated with the overuse of pesticides have been discovered in the blood and breast milk of mothers in the area. The rate of infants in the area who are born underweight or with abnormalities are 5 times higher than in Europe. The mortality rate for children younger than 5 around the former Aral Sea is now the highest anywhere in the world outside of sub-Saharan Africa, and there have been significant increases in the rates of cancers and lung diseases. And these toxic dusts blow all around the world. Aral Sea desert dust has been discovered as far away as Norway and Greenland, while toxic pesticides in the dust have even been discovered contaminating the blood of penguins in Antarctica. But the worst side effect of the Aral Sea's destruction is something that really hasn't even happened yet, but is almost bound to happen in the future. It will eventually push Central Asia into one of the greatest conflicts of the 21st century. You see, with the end of the volume of water in the Aral Sea, there's no longer any significant water evaporation taking place around it, and consequently, the winds blowing in from Siberia that reach the Tian Shan Mountains and Pamir Mountains down in the south and the southeast are carrying a lot less moisture than they used to. And that means that there's less precipitation and snowfall taking place in these mountains than normally feed the glaciers that feed the Amu Darya and Sur Darya rivers in the first place. And then to exacerbate that problem, the dust storms now blowing into the mountains are carrying a lot of salt and dust that are coating the glaciers and accelerating their melting process even further. Because of these local factors, in addition to worldwide climate change, the glaciers in these mountains are now melting at a rate that is 12 times faster than they were before the 1960s when the Soviets began the Transformation of Nature project. And with less snowfall, there's less ability to replace what is being lost. This is why you pretty often now get spectacular and viral footage like this clip that was captured by a British hiker in the mountains of Kyrgyzstan just a few months ago back in July of this year, depicting one of these glaciers' collapse. Now, of course, these glaciers are the primary sources of water that feed the Amu Darya and Sur Darya rivers that used to feed the Aral Sea, not to even mention nearly all of their people's freshwater supplies. When the glaciers here inevitably melt away to lumps, the little water remaining flowing into the rivers will present the nations of Central Asia with potentially their greatest challenge in history. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan higher up in the mountains depend on the water flowing down their steep slopes to generate nearly their entire supplies of electricity. Hydroelectric dams constructed along the Sur Darya provide more than 90% of Kyrgyzstan's electricity, while hydroelectric dams constructed along the Amu Darya provide 98% of Tajikistan's electricity. Both of these countries depend on the water flowing through these rivers for their energy independence and security. But as the water flow inevitably grows less and less with time, they will be incentivized to construct more dams on their rivers to capture more of the river's shrinking energy potential. But building more dams and keeping more of the shrinking water supply for themselves will inevitably become an existential threat to the countries further downstream the rivers like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan that also depend on the river's waters to irrigate their cotton industries. Because without their cotton, it's likely that both of their governments would go bankrupt. And that's still not to even mention that ever since the transformation of nature began here in the 1960s, the region's demographics have radically changed. 60 years ago, back in 1960, Central Asia only had a combined population of about 24 million people, but today, there are 3 times as many people around, at about 75 million. And the country that has contributed the most towards that overall growth is Uzbekistan. Their population has grown by 4-fold over the past 60 years, and there are now roughly as many Uzbeks in Central Asia as all the other ethnic groups there combined: the Kazakhs, the Kyrgyz, the Tajiks, and the Turkmen. Consequently, the human demand for water in Central Asia is multiple times higher today than it was before the death of the Aral Sea, and it is the Uzbeks who have the strongest single demand. The political borders of all the countries in Central Asia were largely drawn up by Joseph Stalin nearly a century ago in order to ensure maximum conflict between them were they ever to become independent in the future, as they did in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. All of the region's ethnicities are mixed up across each other's borders, most infamously evidenced by the Soks district found here, 2 chunks of Uzbekistan that are completely surrounded by Kyrgyzstan and entirely populated by ethnic Tajiks. As a consequence of these kinds of Soviet-era policies and tactics, there are millions of Uzbeks who live just outside of the borders of Uzbekistan, the state, across regions of Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and Kazakhstan. As the supply of Central Asia's water in its 2 primary rivers dries up, there will simply not be enough water to supply everybody's needs and meet everybody's security. And Uzbekistan will be the most geopolitically well-placed to outmaneuver and dominate the others in order to ensure that they will be the ones to control whatever remains of the water. The Fergana Valley here is the population core of Central Asia. It is where the Sir Darya River begins, effectively making the valley a lush oasis in the middle of the otherwise empty desert. A quarter of Central Asia's population lives within this valley, and it is also precisely where the political borders of Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan all converge to clash. The neck of Tajikistan that stretches up into the valley in the north is primarily inhabited by ethnic Uzbeks, and yet it largely serves to divide Uzbekistan the state into 2 distinct halves, separating their control in the valley from the rest of the country. Under a pretext of ethnic liberation, like the Russians have been experimenting with in Ukraine, it's no longer inconceivable that Uzbekistan could one day use this as their casus belli as well, to attack and invade Tajikistan at some point in the future, in order to not only secure more of the fertile Fergana Valley, but if they go for an all-out conquest of Tajikistan, they can secure the headwaters of the Amu Darya as well, in order to ensure their continued access to whatever remains of the river's depleted water supplies. And at the same time, Turkmenistan continues to divert enormous volumes of water away from the Amu Darya River through their inefficient Karakum Canal to irrigate their own cotton fields. However, nearly 600,000 Uzbeks live within Turkmenistan just across the border from present-day Uzbekistan, and they all happen to be located almost directly adjacent to the start of the Karakum Canal that diverts all of that water away from the Amu Darya and away from Uzbekistan. If Uzbekistan utilizes the pretext of ethno-nationalist unification to go to war with Tajikistan in order to secure the headwaters of the Amu Darya River, then it's also conceivable that they would use the exact same pretext to also go to war with Turkmenistan in order to secure and destroy the Karakum Canal, thus ensuring their own complete control over the entire river's remaining water supply. Under that scenario, Turkmenistan will almost certainly collapse as a state, because the Karakum Canal is where Turkmenistan still acquires the vast majority of their own freshwater supplies for their own people and cotton industry. But on paper, Uzbekistan has got the numbers and the demographic odds on its side to win this future conflict. And with Russia facing demographic and military catastrophe of their own in Ukraine, it is now unlikely that Moscow would be capable of fending off Uzbekistan's attacks on its supposed allies. Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan are theoretically members of the CSTO military alliance, essentially Russia's version of NATO, meaning that they could each appeal to Russia for military assistance were Uzbekistan ever to go on the offensive. But in September of 2022, Azerbaijan attacked Armenia, another CSTO member state who appealed to the alliance for support, and Russia refused, because they're too busy getting wrecked in Ukraine. Russia is a distracted and dying empire, and they would likely possess little ability or will to interfere with the worsening geopolitical situation to their south in Central Asia. That potentially leaves China to intervene, but who knows how willing they would even be to do so, with their own internal concerns in Xinjiang and Tibet, zero COVID, and foreign policy objectives more closely focused on Taiwan. Regardless of how the events play out, Central Asia is effectively a powder keg waiting to blow, and if I were you, I would be paying a lot closer attention to what's going on there, and specifically, what is happening in Uzbekistan. It may very well become the country that makes the most headlines later on this decade. Ultimately, in the end, the Soviet Great Transformation of Nature certainly worked in the sense that it did indeed greatly transform the nature and the environment of Central Asia forever. It just wasn't in the way that they had hoped. Their quest to bend nature to the will of man here is perhaps one of the greatest lessons to face humanity over its entire existence. When we attempt to play God and change the way the Earth works, it's just like playing with a monkey's paw and asking it for a wish. Your wish may be granted, but not at all in the way that you expect it to be. The environmental curse that the Aral Sea's absence has established across Central Asia will be with us all for a very long time, and the worst of its consequences have still yet to even manifest themselves. For whenever man attempts to fight against nature, nature will always win eventually, because nature has billions of years longer than we've got. All of us only have a limited amount of time in a given day, and it's hard to dedicate a lot of that precious time to something we all love doing, eating. Taking yourself to a grocery store and painstakingly searching for everything you need or want and then driving back home just takes up a lot of time. But HelloFresh greatly innovates on this inefficient model by shipping precisely what you want in the exact quantity you need directly to your front door. You just use their app or website to select one of 30 different meal options each week, and then all of their ingredients show up directly on your doorstep in an insulated, ice-packed box. They're so good at this that they'll even adjust the amount of ice and type of insulation depending on the temperature of the shipping route and destination. And then you just get to go straight to cooking with all of the instructions provided on each meal's recipe card. And the cooking goes quicker than you'd expect, since you don't have to deal with measuring at all and certain ingredients already come pre-prepared. That way, you can make a delicious, home-cooked meal in only around 30 minutes, without spending any of your time shopping or meal planning. Personally, it really allows me to fit a lot more cooking into my busy schedule. And that means I can avoid ordering more expensive delivery food or eating unhealthy frozen meals. That's why I've been using HelloFresh myself now for over 2 years, and I regularly order some of my all-time favorites from them, like this amazing buffalo spiced chicken. All around, HelloFresh is just a better way to eat. And it's often cheaper too, especially since you can click the button that's here on screen right now, or by following the link down in the description below and use code RealLifeLore70 to get 70% off plus free shipping. And as always, thank you so much for watching.